Welcome to the Barbell Strategy Podcast,
where we talk about coaching,
training,
and all things strength and conditioning
to help the fitness athlete,
CrossFitter, and the coach. Please share and enjoy.
Welcome to our second episode on season number 2, where we're going to be covering strength. And in the last episode, we spoke about our sort of own journeys through strength, some of the fantastic ideas that we had in terms of our programs and things like that when we first started, and then how that's translated into our coaching. And what we're going to go through today is, you could say, is a little bit of a follow-on from that episode, and we're going to just talk about the different stages of an athlete in their journey and what type of strength development that they should be looking at. So I suppose there's part of it is going to be, us reflecting on what we had previously done and maybe what would we do if we were able to start again. But then again, what we'll be looking at is how to sort of develop general barbell strength. So we're going to be talking mainly today about, things like squats, deads and presses. There's obviously going to be some element of weightlifting and that type of stuff within the discussion, but what we'll do is we'll try to keep this a little bit more just around general absolute strength. So one of the mistakes that I think quite a lot of people do is they will do something which is a little bit higher qualification or a little bit too advanced. So they may be a beginner and they're just sort of jumping into a strength program which probably is a little bit more for that intermediate level athlete, and this happens quite often, and I think in both of our cases it happened with us as well. And what that can do is it can just sort of accelerate your progress a little bit too quickly, and it doesn't necessarily give you as long a runway of development. So when we're thinking about taking an athlete through different phases of their training, beginner, intermediate, advanced, elite, however you want to term it, what we're looking to do in that beginner phase is we're looking to do the appropriate things, which obviously gives us the results that allow us to make progress for the longest possible time and not necessarily the fastest. There are going to be times when you do want to accelerate your progress. It could be competition, it could be for whatever reason. It could be just say you might be working with a client who realistically only has about 2 years to put into competing before they move on to another part of their life or something like that. So what we'll do is we'll start to talk about beginners and their priorities. Sam, what would be some of the priorities for a beginner level athlete, or maybe someone who's coming in who's completely new, in terms of their strength development for you?
I think the big thing, you tend to notice quite a big difference between male and female, I always find, in beginners, because I feel like guys tend to have spent more time doing strength training prior to starting CrossFit. I think guys generally tend to have done more strength training prior to starting CrossFit, which gives them a stronger base to start from. Whereas I find females, especially upper body strength wise, they tend not to have that same level of strength development, which when you, obviously from a strength perspective, that's one thing, but then also when we start to look at gymnastics and gymnastic development, then they tend to be a little bit further behind because of that lack of upper body strength. So for me, with beginners, it's a case of how much strength training have you been doing up to this point, and where are you up to now, to assess because they might be a beginner in CrossFit, but from a strength perspective, they might be more advanced, depending on that training background, which is then going to determine what we're going to do with them to make that progress. Because obviously, like you say, in terms of accelerating and that runway for strength gains, that's one thing. But there's also, with beginners, there's so many things that you want to develop and they want to develop. It's from an efficiency perspective, how little of this can we do so that we're maintaining time to work on other things like Olympic weightlifting technique or gymnastic skill development. And it's looking at that whole picture to then think, okay, then from a strength perspective, this is where we're going to start, And obviously within that, you've got your foundational lifts that underpin everything. So you've got your back squat, front squat, deadlift and press. They're like the main strength exercises that are going to carry over into the rest of your CrossFit training and your Olympic weightlifting. But then obviously then from there, then you can start to add in the things like your overhead squats, the more kind of complex movements. But from a beginner, they might get enough from just learning how to snatch first, and they don't need to add that kind of thing in. So for me, I think just keeping it simple, keep it focused around those movements, look at the frequency, the intensity and the volume that they've already been doing, and then look to just go from there with the minimum possible amount on top of what they've been doing to get that progress. That's your starting point for me.
Yeah, I definitely think the sort of assessment of where the athlete is, what they've done previously, because strength training can also just sort of come under a number of different ways. It can be that, someone could be coming from a sports background and they've just done some sort of, basic fitness which involves, push-ups and pull-ups and maybe some, they do some circuits with some sandbag squats, but then you might have someone who comes in from a bodybuilding background as well. And then for that person, they've done so much pulling and pushing that the gymnastics might be a little bit easier for them, but then they're probably struggling to get into positions. Their torsos are very rigid and tight. So they might be needing to spend more time focusing on, the more skill-based barbell work, the more mobility demanding movements and that type of stuff. But I think from if we're just sort of going to play the sort of thought experiment that someone is coming in and they haven't really done any formal gym training or anything like that, or maybe they've just sort of been in classes for a couple of months, and that you can still term them as a beginner. I would focus a lot on, I would say you could call it more bodybuilding type stuff, but it would just be bodybuilding work that was working through a full range of motion, higher time under tension, more variations as well. And the reason for that, I think, is that in this phase, you're really trying to sort of develop a foundation of movement, trying to develop motor control, and you see it when, say for example, a beginner does bench press, and if someone is a complete beginner to that movement, you can see them in a set of 8 actually learning to coordinate the movement better during that set. Like they'll do 1 rep that's okay, and then 2 reps that are a little bit shaky, and then they sort of figure it out, and then on rep 4, and then that feedback loop becomes bigger and bigger. So rather than it being in the middle of a set, rep to rep, there's learning going on, we can see that expanding out to set to set, and then session to session, and then variation to variation, right? So you could be doing one variation for a couple of weeks, and then you're doing another one. And I think you're trying to give them a lot of different inputs in that sense. Not too many to the point where they're just not grasping anything. It could be that you have, a category of movement. It could be, this is where the sort of Poliquin style, lower body push, upper body pull, paired on one day, and then on another day you've got like an upper body push and lower body hinge paired as well. And I think that's where that can come in handy, and you're sort of manipulating, I would say, you're not really focusing on the weight that's going to be used. It obviously needs to be a working weight, but they're going to get stronger by just being more consistent. And I think the interesting thing you can get from this is strength development without the sort of wear and tear that you would get from back squatting once a week or pressing once a week and all of that type of stuff that accumulates over a period of time. However, I would say that you do need to, because they would be a CrossFitter, you do need to practice your movements like your back squat, front squat, deadlift, strict press, push press, overhead squat, all of these types of things. You need to practice them from a sports skill perspective. So you're establishing a standard of movement, you're maintaining that, and you're at least giving them, it could be that they have one one day where they're back squatting in the week, and then on their sort of secondary squat day, it could be one week is a double kettlebell front squat, on another week is a Zercher squat, on another week it's something else. And then this way they're learning how to coordinate the movement through the weight being on their body in different ways, through them having to sort of brace and manage it a little bit differently. Because I think you see it quite often where someone it's almost they become like functionally adapted to only back squatting, and then you see them try to do like a double kettlebell front squat or like a cyclist squat or something like that, and maybe they only go down to just below parallel, they arch the shit out of their back, and they sort of go really wide with their stance and that type of stuff, and then you sort of try to mix it up a little bit, and then they almost just look like, you know, Bambi on ice, and they just don't know how to coordinate the movement because they're just so fixated on that way of back squatting or whatever it is. And I experienced that, and I was probably just did way too many of just like the basic barbell lift or squatting in particular, just straight out the bat.
No, definitely, and I think they're going to be exposed to lots of different variations of squatting, for example, within CrossFit anyway.
Yeah.
So if we can do that early on and do it in a more controlled manner, then that's only going to be better for them. And I think as well, they find, obviously you have your typical, this is how we teach a squat thing, but they also find out that their own biomechanics are going to be slightly different and how that feels for them. And obviously they're squatting in a safe way, but not everybody's squat is going to be perfectly upright with their knees coming into the perfect position and maintaining the right shin angle, or whatever that even is. Do you know what I mean? So by using those variations, they find what's comfortable, they find where they feel strongest, and they also find where they feel weakest, which is also good information for us. But I also think as well, for beginners, it's learning what strength training should feel like. You know, like how hard should this be for me to actually make progress, as opposed to just doing the set, compared to actually getting a benefit from the set. Because I think for people who've not got that background, if you say, oh, this is, you know, a set of 5 back squats, it should feel heavy. Either you get people who are maxing out on every set, or you get people who are, you can see that they're more than comfortable.
Yeah.
And all right, at the start, they might still progress from that because they, like you say, they're getting that understanding of the movement and the technique, and they're becoming more efficient. But they need to know, actually, if we say this is what a set of 5 back squats should feel like at, just say 80%, they understand what that actually means, so that as they progress with their training journey, they are actually able to push themselves in the right way.
Yeah, you just reminded me of a funny story. When back in Q8, it must have been like 2014, I started to try and program, it was like a linear strength program within the session. It was like the 5 plus each week add, you know. And honestly, in Q8, I'm not too sure what it was like in Abu Dhabi, but like people were so consistent to the gym. You can program Mondays to be a linear strength day, and people just turn up, and it's not like, you know, you're trying to fight for people to turn up 3 days a week on a consistent basis, right? Everyone's there. But there's this young lad who was like Mubarak, and I remember that myself and another coach, you met him at the wedding, Ben. We were like pretty familiar with this. He was running, I think, some version of a similar squat program at the time, and then one of the coaches was just not completely with it. Like he knew what he was doing. So anyway, this kid, he came in, and it was like his first session, or it was his first day on the squat program, and he never really back squatted before. He could coordinate the movement really fine. Mobility was, you know, spot on and stuff. So he did the 5, and he was working at like 25 kilos. And then on the 5 plus, I think he was going for like sort of, I think at some stage someone sort of turned around and he was going, and he was like 30 plus reps, like screaming. And it was just like his legs were burning, and I'm like, oh my God. But I was like the complete, you got some people who are just not wired up. But that is an example of just the like that type of stuff actually does make people stronger. Like as a beginner, you just need to look at a barbell and you get stronger. And it's but you touch on an interesting point actually with the whole CrossFit providing that variation, because I follow a lot of people who are sort of in the strength and conditioning world, let's call it, on social media, and they're all arguing about including more variation into training. And a lot of these ones who are a little bit more in line with my thinking, you could say that their main gripe with a lot of strength and conditioning is people specializing in just doing a powerlifting program and then and then expecting to have some sort of athletic development from that. So they'll be talking about, well, it's actually okay to round your back in a deadlift. It's actually okay if you do this, and you're not, you should be trying to encourage movement variation. You should be doing, different versions of squatting variations, and you should do Zercher squats and all this type of stuff. But the argument is always around that, and that's one thing I noticed, that you just don't actually have to have those arguments or those chats in CrossFit, because everyone fucking does everything. And you'll be pulling off the floor one day and it's a deadlift. You'll be pulling off the floor another day and it's I don't know, 2 heavy kettlebells. Or you'll be pulling off the floor one day and it's a sandbag and you're trying to lap a sandbag, and that just requires a completely different approach to coordinating the movement and everything like that. It's, you could say it's not really a deadlift, but this is something I see actually that CrossFit might have in its favor, is just you are being exposed to many different ways of moving, and it could be just doing a barbell thruster requires you just to have a little bit better awareness around your front squat and the balance that you're in, and maybe how you grip the bar and all of these types of things. And I think that those little learnings that you have when you're doing different workouts and this type of stuff, I think actually really helps people, and that's what makes them pretty adaptable. And it can be a bit of a shame when you see someone who's a CrossFitter just sort of almost specializing down that powerlifter or weightlifter route, because there's a lot of good stuff to come from the other types.
Oh yeah, definitely. They're automatically, like you say, they're cutting out a lot of variation. But I think it's also good to see it the other way around too. When you see powerlifters, for example, who will experiment with doing even, not necessarily even weightlifting related things, but they'll experiment with doing like little bits of conditioning and interval work alongside their training too, because of the extra variation to their training that it gives them. I think when you think of specialization in terms of sports, like say team sports, all right, it's specialized, but the demands are very varied. Whereas the unique thing about sports like powerlifting and Olympic weightlifting is the demands are very specific. Yeah. So variation looks very different. Okay, it might be varied in terms of the exercises that we use, but in terms of some of the more kind of athletic, dynamic, physical skills, how varied are they really? Yeah. And I think that's where working with beginners, but especially in CrossFit, where exposing them to that variation as much as possible, you develop in as big of a base as possible to then build from as they progress down that route.
Yeah, it's definitely going to be slower progress at the start, and it might not be as fun as just whacking on a couple of kilos more on the bar every single time. Like, you think of starting strength, it's add 5 pounds per session. You're squatting twice a week. It's like 20 kilos in 2 weeks, yeah. So yeah, moving on from that, actually, I mean, that sort of ties in quite well, talking about starting strength. And this is something I touched on earlier. I think the intermediate level program, or the intermediate way of developing strength, I think ends up actually becoming the beginner way for a lot of people involved in CrossFit, or it might be just sort of their first exposure to like a real strength training program, and that usually comes in the form of something like starting strength or 5-3-1, maybe the juggernaut method, but this is where sort of the volume is built up with the basic lifts, and you're not necessarily working to a max, but you are sort of working maximally in certain ways where you are focused on progress, and it could be that you're doing AMRAP sets, and part of this is, developing practice of the movement, developing your sort of skill and refining it, starting to just go a little bit deeper.
Hey everyone, Matt Harvey here. I produced this podcast that you're listening to or watching just now, so if you like the way that it looks and sounds, that's partially down to me. If you've got a podcast, video, or other online project that you'd like some production help with, or even if you just want to chat through some ideas, drop me a DM or an email. My details can be found in the show notes below. Thanks so much for your time. On with the show.
Into the movements that are required and the patterns. But I would say something like one of those programs, after you've done a bunch of varied stuff, can fit in quite well, because it's almost like and I like to use this analogy, but through all that variation, you've built a cup and you've built a base, and now you're filling the cup and you're putting in the work and putting in the reps. And this is going to be where a lot of people will really enjoy their progress. This is where, the doing a Russian squat program and that type of stuff for 6 weeks is really fun, because you have the ability to just put more weight on. And I think if you get to one of this sort of stage and you capitalize on one of these sort of programs in the right way, I think that can be very good for an athlete. But I think what ends up happening is people sort of start off too soon with this type of thing, and then they almost like breeze over it, and they don't necessarily run these types of training cycles as many times as they could. And I give you an example. If we think about starting strength, 5-3-1, Texas method, all of these typical strength programs where you essentially have weekly increases. A lot of people don't cycle through when they stop and they're unable to progress. They don't sort of take it back and just run it again. They may stop and then they're just like, well, what's the new thing? And then they find West Side, and then they get into all of that. Whereas actually, you do sort of the reset protocols that these programs have, or maybe you just have a week off, or you have like 4 weeks where you don't focus on those strength lifts. You go back to training a little bit more like a beginner, put in some variation, that type of stuff, and then you revisit it, and it's almost this sort of typical supercompensation sort of step ladder type diagram where you go up, you come down again, but your starting point is a little bit higher, you go up and you come back down again, and you try to repeat that, and you go through those cycles. Because I think I remember one guy who was he was a personal trainer. He worked out at CrossFit Bath, and he was into powerlifting, and he sort of influenced, I know we spoke about this in the last podcast, he influenced sort of some of the programming that the guys were doing at CrossFit Bath. And this was sort of when Wendler and 5-3-1 was pretty popular. I remember he put up a blog post, and I think he ran through 5-3-1, like the Wendler program. He ran through it on a number of occasions, and it took he sort of stopped using it after about a year and a half, 18 months. Stopped using it after a year and a half of just running through that as his sort of like main component of his program, and everything, the accessory work and all that type of stuff around it was a bit more varied. But yeah, that's the type of stuff that I would start to include for someone, because at the intermediate phase, you've gone broad, you've developed your base level experience. It's time to go deep and really start to develop things, and get into that and drink a gallon of milk. What's a gallon? How many pints of milk is
a gallon? I don't know, what is it? It must be, 4 pints definitely isn't a gallon, hey? Mate, that's where I stop at 4 pints. 4 pints of milk, that's it.
I remember I definitely did the whole. I think I tried 2 liters a day.
Oh yeah, of milk. Raw milk.
No,
get the raw milk delivered to the gym.
I don't think I ever got into that. I think I stuck with like the Cravendale whole milk, because it tasted a little bit nicer than the Sainsbury's stuff. But yeah.
No,
mate, literally gave myself a intolerance to lactose.
Oh yeah, you don't need to be doing that, hey?
Yeah.
But no, I think with that, just on what you were saying about running through, say, 5-3-1 multiple times, I think how much of that comes back to a CrossFitter's mentality of, all right, I've done this for 8 weeks, so now I must move on to something new. as opposed to actually thinking, I've done this for 8 weeks, it's worked pretty well. If I have like you say, have a little bit of a break, come back to it, do another 8 weeks, it could work again. Do you know what I mean? It's like, and that's the interesting thing, like you say, perhaps the difference between, say, powerlifters and CrossFitters is some people are just a little bit better at identifying something that works and sticking with it regardless, even if it gets a little bit tedious and a little bit boring. But actually that's okay, because if you're getting the result that you need, then great. Do you know what I mean? And obviously something like, say, 5-3-1, for an intermediate person, it's simple to implement, and it's not super time consuming. You know, if you compare, say, 5-3-1 to something like the Russian squat cycle. On the Russian squat cycle, by the time you're doing that 6 sets of 6, it takes a long time, and it's exhausting. To then want to do anything else after that is hard work. Whereas something like 5-3-1, it takes less time, you feel better afterwards. So if there's then other elements of your session, you're going to get more out of that too. And when you're talking about CrossFitters and looking at the bigger picture, then why rush into the things that are going to, or like what you were saying when you were doing the sets of 8, you know, why rush into the things that are going to take your whole session when you don't need to, you know, and really make the most of the simplest, easiest version of what you need to do to get the result that you want for as long as you possibly can, because eventually you are going to get to a point where you need to either do more or think about things a little bit more, or become a little bit more complex. But don't rush there, because you're going to get there anyway, you know. And I think that again ties in with what you say about beginners rushing into the intermediate thing, because obviously beginners, they've got that interest in what they're doing, they read a lot of different things, they're taking in all this different information, and naturally it's the same for everybody. You want to do the things that you see the people you want to be doing, whether that's the best thing for you or not. And I think that's where having that guidance from a coach to say, look, you're going to get there, but you'll get there. It might feel a little bit counterproductive now, but your progress will be better in the long run if we just take it step by step. I think that's an important thing for people when they're getting into training by themselves and coming out of that class environment where really they've got no say in what they do. They just turn up and do it, you know?
Yeah, the interesting thing around that, you know, talking about this, you're going to get there at some stage, and people wanting to do things maybe a little bit too early in their life cycle as an athlete. One of the things that people need to understand is that when you start to train in a certain way, this then sort of develops your sensitivity to adapt to training. So think of it this way. You're a teenager and you're hanging outside the supermarket with your mates, and you're like, right, we want to get pissed tonight, and you're asking like every single person who looks over 18, hey, can you go and get me some whatever, I'll buy you a pack of fags or whatever it is. And you're thinking, okay, what do we need to do to get drunk tonight? And people buy like small little bottles of vodka and that type of stuff. They're not drinking, you know, low percentage lagers and that type of stuff. But what that ends up doing is you obviously get what you want from it. You get drunk pretty quick, but then it just builds up your tolerance to alcohol to the point where you need that in order to get the effects that you want. And it's exactly the same with training. If you start and you're on a 3-day-a-week squat program or 3-day-a-week of whatever program, you now need more than a 3-day-a-week stimulus to then make strength gains in the future. So let's say, for example, you do the Russian squat program, you PB by 20 kilos, which is huge. Okay, great. Now, for you to make a 2 kilo increase on your squatting strength, you're going to need to do more than what you did. You have to essentially, you either do that or you have to detrain yourself to the point where that becomes sensitive again, and then you end up getting weaker and then having to build it up, and this is sort of where it gets a bit messy. So I think that's one thing people need to understand, is that it's not necessarily just about like where are my numbers right now and what's the best and sort of neatest and tidiest way of getting there. It's more around like, okay, what's my body going to respond to in a year, 2 years, 3 years? And you want it always to be a bit more progressive, because training is not just about choosing the best things to get results. It's also about choosing the best thing for, like, you know, how you actually adapt to your training. And that's one of the things I would say is that when you're in that phase, in that intermediate phase where you can start playing around with these programs, one of the cool things is that you will develop your absolute strength, but you'll also develop your strength endurance. And if you're working sort of, as long as you're not doing some Bulgarian method where you're just hitting singles, if you are working on something which is a little bit more voluminous, you are going to start to develop your strength qualities across a broad spectrum, and you can still do that. You don't need to be, hitting the rep ranges that target absolute strength versus strength endurance and this type. You don't need to separate it. You can still take advantage of some sort of newbie gains in this like intermediate phase.
Definitely. I think what's also interesting though from a coach's perspective is when you've been working with someone for a little while and they're in this kind of phase and like you say, they're doing these different rep ranges and responding to different things, you also start to understand how that person responds more specifically, because you can definitely see patterns in people. In certain people respond much better to lower loads, high volumes, and other people respond much better to low volumes and heavier loads. But it's in that intermediate phase where you're figuring it out, because in the beginner phase, most people will adapt to anything, whereas that intermediate phase, they're still adapting to a lot, but it's starting to have to become a little bit more structured and a little bit more specific. So you can then obviously get that information, which then informs, when they get to the more kind of advanced stage of things, informs the decisions that you're making. I think you also start to get a good idea as to how much they can tolerate, because it might be that they have amazing progress on 5-3-1, but then they do something that's high volume and they just end up getting niggles, or they just feel super fatigued and they lose a lot of what they could be getting from a progress perspective. But then I also think as well, now that they're getting into using weights that are more challenging relative to what their like kind of potential is, you also start to see more, like with a beginner, you see the problems with their movement patterns, but they're things that can be generally fixed by just doing the movement and learning the skill of the movement. Whereas in that intermediate phase, then you might then start to see problems in their movements which are exposed to, say, heavier loads that come down to more of a specific weakness, or a mobility area that they're particularly lacking in, that is making them very inefficient in that movement. And again, it's being able to look at this and extract all that information, which then informs kind of that next phase, which again, if you skip phases, you've never had the chance to really learn that, either about yourself or about the person that you're working with.
Yeah, and like people move through this at different rates as well. Some people are really good responders to training and they just will, whereas others will just, even with more advanced athletes, some athletes still do all right with, like, you could call it more of this basic, more volume-based strength training progressions, and you don't necessarily need to be as sort of broad about it as someone gets into more advanced phases. One thing I would say as well, like, whilst you're going through all of this in that beginner and intermediate phase, all of these other things related to strength, all these other qualities where it's speed and power and all of this different type of stuff along the force velocity curve, I think this type of stuff is generally developed in a very general sense. It's small little doses here and there and that type of stuff. And that can have a nice way of making someone's strength development a little bit more complete. But I think that when we start to move into more of an advanced phase, this is where, I spoke earlier about going broad as a beginner, going deep as an intermediate. I think you start to go a bit broad again when you're more advanced, and you start to need to have more variety in how you're expressing your strength training, and you need more variety in the load you're using, the speed you're using, the types of contraction, and all this type of stuff. And this is where I think we see all of the advanced training going on and this type of thing. We always want to jump into it. That's all good and it's fun, and I do think sometimes doing things just because it's sort of fun, and in that sense can be okay. It can be a fine thing to do. But you've also got to ask yourself, maybe you're able to use something much less demanding on the body to develop that strength. Maybe a simple 3x5 was gonna do it. Rather than that, you did a top set on Monday, speed squats on the Wednesday, and then you did your volume work on the Friday or something like that. Maybe you didn't need that. But just going into the more advanced work, I would say this is where, if we think of programs and we think of ways of programming, this is where you would start, I would say, to manipulate the training stress a bit more. So the training stress is a little bit more varied, it's a bit more different, and this can go in a couple of ways. You could, sort of go the approach of, say, the conjugate method, where you're using lots of different variation, you're sort of using, and I also think that like the conjugate method is a nice way of, if you really zoom out of it and you don't think bands and chains and all that type of stuff, and you think maximal volume, speed, and all this type of thing, I do think that's a nice way of framing and looking at training for sort of everyone, right? It's this, you ever heard of like vertical integration from Charlie Francis? So it's like, doing a bit of everything. Anyway, you've got that, but then the other side of it is, if you want to take more of a simple variation, it could be like undulating periodization, where you've got your four focused lifts. 1 week you're going heavy on the other, and then that heavy session doesn't come around again until 3 weeks time or 4 weeks time, and you're working more volume. But you need to start to expose the athlete to more stuff when they're in that advanced stage.
Yeah, definitely. I think obviously giving them that variation is important. But I think the thing for me is, generally by that point, like I say, when you've got that understanding of them, it's giving them a variation, but it's also finding the balance between the variation and what they need the most of. Because I think, like I say, by that point, it might be that someone has great absolute strength, but really poor speed strength or really poor strength endurance. So as opposed to keeping things balanced, it might be that we've got that variation week to week or month to month, but you're predominantly focusing on this because right now this is what you need more. But if they just do that all the time, then either they get fed up of it, or the progress starts to slow down a little bit, or they become almost too much of that and not enough. They lose a little bit of balance, which hopefully by the time they get to that point, they've got a reasonable amount of balance relative to what they need to do. But inevitably, there's always going to be people who are more one than the other, and it's figuring that out. But it's also thinking, does it matter how much of this we do? Is this you now? Do we, knowing where your strengths lie, we know, okay, if you do this, you just don't respond to it. So what's the point? Is that a waste of training time? Or do we focus on the things that we know that you do respond to keep that progress going? Obviously, the rate of progress is going to slow down as you progress into that more advanced stage, but we still want to keep it going as much as we possibly can. So understanding you and understanding how you react, let's milk that and continue to milk it as much as we can. And every now and again we might throw in some heavier singles, but most of your training is going to be the higher rep ranges because that's what you react to,
Yeah, I do think it might be like maybe a point of difference there, but like I think if you're working in a sport as varied as CrossFit, I do think you need to approach the training a little bit more from this like concurrent phase, where you obviously have certain things that you're going to do, like if you've been working with an athlete for a while, you're obviously going to play their greatest hits in terms of like, we know how to get you strong, so let's do that. This is the time we're in to do that. There's going to be those types of things going on, but I almost think of the CrossFit is like the team sport, or like the one of these sort of more chaotic sports, the open loop sport is like that of like gym-based sports, whereas you know exactly what you are training for in the sense of a weightlifting competition or a powerlifting competition, or even if you're a gymnasticist, or you've got a very specific protocols to sort of get you there, and that's where that ability to just really get as much as you can from a certain training stimulus or a certain program is going to be helpful. But with CrossFit, there is this sort of, you don't want to be undercooking things to the point where you're not, call it 2-4 weeks away from getting back to close to your best. So you've got to maintain things to be pretty high, and also I would generally say all year round as well. I think one of the mistakes some people have made in the past, not so much now, and sometimes you do see some people still make it, but they will just try to be a little bit too dialed in. They'll go through some block periodization type work for their strength and their endurance, and they'll very much be thinking about, okay, I'm going to start off very low intensity, high volume, and then peak at some stage. And I think that those ideas can be useful, but it's very different to what is actually required in the sport. I think your goal is basically just to get, like, CrossFitters need to train as much as they physically have the training bandwidth to. It's not about, oh, we're now doing 3-hour sessions because we're in a base building phase, and then that turns into intense 1-hour sessions at something. Like, no, you got so much shit that you need to do. You got to be running on that stuff. It needs to be close to sort of high output all the time. But I think that's an interesting one with I like how you're sort of threading in the sort of, okay, what is the individual responding to, because I do think it is super varied. I hear about powerlifting coaches who literally have their lifters running 6s before they go into a competition. They're not, they might do some singles to practice, but their best sort of strength development and preparation for competition has notoriously happened from doing higher volume work. So that's what they do. That's their competition prep. It's not the competition prep that you're going to read about in a strength and conditioning book.
Yeah, no, exactly. That's it. And I think it's understanding that. I think going back to what you were saying before about always maintaining a certain level within CrossFit, I think, as much as we can say, oh, this is when we're going to compete on these days, I think we also probably both know people who will turn around with a week's notice and say, I'm going to do this competition next weekend. Is that okay, coach? Do you know what I mean?
But I think people view it like playing football with their mates or something.
Yeah, exactly. So I think there always has to be a level of preparedness, like you say. I think what the thing that we can do is use like almost a sliding scale, where you're never not doing anything, but how much of it you might do might vary at a certain stage, depending roughly on a plan, or the plan might not even be around a competition. The plan might be around something more specific, around a specific weakness or something like that, and it is just, that's what we need to prioritize right now, but we're still going to do a little bit of this. We're not going to ditch it completely, so I think that's definitely something that I've learned too, because again, I think in the past, even like from my own training, there's been times when it's like, right, I need to get stronger. I'm not going to do any conditioning, And in your head, especially when we were younger, it's like, well, yeah, okay, if I do less condition, I'll get stronger faster, which A, I don't think is necessarily true, but also B, then you then have to spend just as much time getting your conditioning back up to the point you need it to be at to match your strength. So you're kind of shooting yourself in the foot a little bit, and you're not actually gaining in the long run, and obviously with the different elements of strength training, it's the same thing, because at the end of the day, they interlink anyway. It's no good saying I just need to get really good speed strength and rate of force development or really good strength endurance and not doing any things that improve your absolute strength, because it's part of the same equation.
Yeah.
Do you know what I mean?
Developing one is going to help do it, raise the ceiling to develop others. Yeah.
Exactly. It might just be that at one point in time your absolute strength is here, but your strength endurance is here. But that doesn't mean you go like that. It means you go like that. And that's where that sliding scale and things like that come in to really make the most of that. So you end up being not just well-rounded, but the best at being you're at the highest level and you're still well-rounded,
I think one thing, and this is sort of just maybe an interesting finishing point to flip it on its head, but like, are we even confident that we're actually getting those adaptations from doing those certain things, right? because like the general strength and conditioning, there's a lot of strength and conditioning literature these days which is around about like block periodization doesn't exist. Athletes work and develop on, or they adapt to training in very different ways. I think maybe what's a better way of going about it, rather than saying like no, I don't know if I'm developing absolute strength or not, so just sit on the fucking assault bike instead and hopefully you'll get stronger. I think we could just look at it more from the perspective of like, it's pragmatic that you do things in, let's say you're hitting a slow lower body lift in the 1 to 3 rep range that's a bit tough every week. You're doing an Olympic lift, which is a tough set, at least once a week. You're doing some stuff which is a little bit more voluminous and might be in a conditioning format once a week. Like it's a bit, I think that is, I've started to look at my training a little bit, or the programming a little bit more like that, because we can say, all right, yeah, based off of these percentages and this is what is going to happen, but like, unless you're on gear, like there's the story of Ed Cohen, who was like one of the best powerlifters ever, and he just said, I would just say my numbers for this competition would be this, and then I would just work backwards and write my sessions from like, one session out from comp, or like 1 week out from comp, these are the numbers I need to hit. 2 weeks out, this is what I need to hit. 3 weeks, and then it was just like, if training was only just that simple,
But I think that part of that comes back to what we said in the very first episode, in that the difference between research and the practical side of coaching someone in a gym within CrossFit in particular is very different.
Yeah.
Because of the controls that are in place in research that aren't in place in CrossFit. And I think obviously as well, the level of specificity they can put into measuring something in a research setting. So if they're saying, okay, we want to develop your rate of force development, so you're going to do this set, and you're just going to do as many reps as you can, as long as the bar speed stays above 1.2 meters per second. Sweet. Whereas if you said to someone in a CrossFit gym, if you ask them to do that, there's no way of they're even measuring it. Most of them don't have the equipment to measure it, and they're also going to wonder what on earth you're asking them to do. So we look for an intermediate strategy that we think fits that pattern to implement it well. But like you say, we don't know that, and especially when you're coaching someone remotely.
Yeah.
we can plan it, but what they actually do in practice might be a little bit different to what we intended.
Yeah, usually like the amount of times I've written like maintain good bar speed, and I see the video and it's like, it's grindy as hell, and I'm like, fucking it.
Exactly. Because it's like, well, what is good bar speed?
Yeah.
It's a very general term.
I know, and you don't know.
For us, it might mean that the bar doesn't decelerate at all through the movement, whereas to them, it might be slow out the bottom of the squat and then exploding at the very end, and they get a little bounce off their traps and it feels fast. Do you know what I mean? So I know what you mean, as in, how much does this specificity of thought process actually matter versus do the thing, let the adaptations happen, and that's what you get, Yeah,
it's very, very much like that bottoms up way of going about it versus a top down.
Yeah, exactly. But I think as coaches, naturally, you want to understand the logic behind what you're doing and try and find the best way to implement it. And I think that's when you look to the research to say, okay, in theory, this should happen. Let's see if it does.
I also think that sometimes it's not necessarily, like, I don't think you need to be coming away from this and be like, all right, I'm going to go and read, 5 papers and come up with program proposals from that. But it could be just, if you are generally just taking in good information, this is sort of more to the coaches out there. Like, if you're taking in good information and you're sort of putting into practice yourself a little bit through your own training and also, through coaching others, a lot of these programming decisions sort of just come down to like this idea of like, okay, well, what's the next logical thing to do? And if you have like a clear idea of sort of where they need to be and where they're at right now, that's pretty like, it makes it a lot easier than sort of trying to dissect all of these very complex ideas and really try to like see how you can thread them into a program. It can be, all right, do we need something that's going to be more intense or more enduring, or you can think about it in these very broad ways. So yeah, please don't take from that question in any sense that none of this matters, because at this stage I think we're like, this is episode 8. Yeah, this is episode 8. So we've been talking for beyond 8 hours about something that might not matter, but that's definitely not the case. It all matters. But yeah,
I think it definitely matters. I think it's a case of just understanding what parts to get overly hung up on and what not to get overly hung up on. Because the other thing within all of this is whatever you prescribe, it also has to be executed well.
Yeah.
And that comes back to what we were saying at the beginning about, say, beginner athletes. It's making sure, as a coach, it's making sure that they know how to train in an effective way so that what you give them is going to work, as opposed to if they don't, then obviously it doesn't matter what you give them anyway, because they're not going to get the most out of it.
Most important thing, record your training and tell others to do it, because that is your sort of information that you make your decisions based off.
Oh, 100%. The more information you've got, the better. Both in what you see, but in what they tell you as well. Because sometimes what you see and what they tell you can be quite different. And I think that's when you need to intervene a little bit and give a little bit more guidance.
I think that's a good point to finish on. All right, so that is our sort of more actionable episode on strength development. What we're going to go through in the next episode will be more talking around strength endurance and, let's call it, niche CrossFit strength, and the types of things which might not get as much attention, might not be as fun to do. But thank you very much for listening. Please share this with your training buddies and your coaching buddies. Give us 5 stars, subscribe on YouTube, all of that stuff. And yeah, we'll see you on here next time.